On my mother's 57th birthday, she looked me straight in the eyes and told me her only wish was for me to disappear from her life forever. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs as I stood in her kitchen, holding the homemade red velvet cake I'd spent 3 hours perfecting. The same cake I'd made for her every birthday since I was 12 years old. But before I tell you how those words led me down a path of revenge that would change both our lives forever, if you've ever felt the crushing weight of a parent's rejection, if you've ever wondered what it takes to completely reinvent yourself out of pure spite, then you need to hear this story. Hit that subscribe button right now because what I'm about to share will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty and the dangerous power of a woman scorned. The morning had started like any other birthday celebration in the Martinez household. I'd driven the 43 minutes from my cramped studio apartment in downtown Portland to the suburban house I grew up in, the same house where my mother, Rosa Martinez, still lived alone since Dad passed 5 years ago. I remember the way the October sunlight filtered through the maple trees lining Elm Street, casting dancing shadows across the sidewalk as I balanced the cake box and a carefully wrapped present in my arms. I should have known something was wrong the moment she answered the door. Usually, Mom would greet me with that warm smile that crinkled the corners of her dark eyes, the one that made me feel like I was still her little girl despite being 31 years old. But that morning, her face was stone cold, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke of disappointment and something else I couldn't quite identify at the time. Something that looked dangerously close to hatred. "You came," she said flatly, stepping aside to let me in without the usual hug, without even looking at the cake I'd spent hours decorating with her favorite buttercream roses. "Of course I came, Mom. It's your birthday." I tried to keep my voice light, ignoring the way my stomach clenched at her cold reception. "I made your favorite cake, and I have something special for you." She led me to the kitchen in silence, her slippers shuffling against the hardwood floors that Dad had installed the year before his heart attack. The house felt different somehow, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets I wasn't privy to. Family photos that had lined the hallway for decades seemed to stare at me accusingly, and I noticed with a sharp pang that several pictures of me had been turned face down. That should have been my first real warning. I set the cake on the familiar granite countertop, the same surface where I'd done homework, where Mom had taught me to knead dough for her famous empanadas, where we'd shared countless conversations about everything from boys to dreams to the future I thought we'd share together. The kitchen smelled different too, missing the usual scent of her vanilla candles, replaced by something clinical and cold. "Coffee?" I asked, moving toward the machine out of habit, but she stopped me with a sharp gesture. "We need to talk, Sophia." The way she said my name made my blood run cold. Not Sophie, not Mija, not any of the dozen affectionate nicknames she'd used my entire life. Just Sophia, formal and distant, like she was addressing a stranger. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated every birthday, every holiday, every milestone in my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was where everything would fall apart. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she began, her voice eerily calm. "About you. About us, about the kind of daughter you've become." My heart started pounding. "Mom, what are you talking about?" She pulled out a manila folder from the drawer beside her, one I'd never seen before, and spread its contents across the table like evidence in a trial. Bank statements, printed emails, photographs, all documenting my life in ways that made my skin crawl. How long had she been collecting this information about me? How long had she been planning this moment? "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Did you think I was stupid, Sophia?" I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bank statements showing my modest savings account, printouts of my social media posts, even a copy of my lease agreement. None of it made sense. None of it was incriminating or shameful or worthy of this level of scrutiny. "Find out about what?" I whispered, genuinely confused. "About the lies. About the secrets. About the way you've been living your life." She picked up one of the bank statements, waving it at me like a weapon. "You told me you were struggling to make ends meet. You told me you needed help with rent, with groceries, with everything. And like a fool, I believed you." The room started spinning. Yes, I had asked for help occasionally. When my freelance graphic design work was slow, when clients didn't pay on time, when life got overwhelming, I'd turn to my mother for support, just like she'd always told me I could. What daughter doesn't need help sometimes? Mom, I don't understand. I never lied about $3,000 in savings, Sophia. $3,000 sitting in your account while you cried to me about being broke. While you let me worry myself sick about whether you were eating enough, sleeping somewhere safe. Her voice cracked, but not with sadness, with rage. I've been working double shifts at the hospital for months to help you, sacrificing my own comfort, my own retirement, my own peace of mind. The accusation hung in the air between us, like poison. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that $3,000 wasn't wealth, that it was my emergency fund, the tiny safety net I'd managed to scrape together after years of instability. But the look in her eyes told me that explanations wouldn't matter. She'd already made up her mind about who I was and what I'd done. I have been such a fool, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Enabling you, supporting you, believing in you when everyone else could see exactly what you were. What I was. I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. A user. A liar. A disappointment. Each word landed like a physical blow. Do you know what your cousin Miguel said to me last week? He asked why I kept throwing money at my failure of a daughter instead of enjoying my golden years. Miguel. My mind raced, trying to piece together how he fit into this nightmare. Miguel, who'd always resented that my parents had helped me through college while his parents couldn't afford to do the same for him. Miguel, who'd been making snide comments about my career choices for years, who seemed to take pleasure in my struggles. You talked to Miguel about my personal business? The betrayal of that revelation stung almost as much as her accusations. He's family. Real family. The kind that tells the truth instead of spinning lies to get what they want. She stood up abruptly, beginning to pace the small kitchen like a caged animal. He showed me how to look up your accounts online, how to see what you were really doing with your money. He opened my eyes to what everyone else could already see. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Miguel had somehow gotten access to my financial information, probably through social engineering or his job at the bank, and had been feeding my mother a twisted version of my reality. But why? What did he gain from destroying my relationship with my own mother? I tried to close the distance between us, to somehow bridge the chasm that had opened up in our kitchen. Mom, please listen to me. There's more to this story than what Miguel told you. Let me explain. Explain what? Explain how you've been manipulating me? Explain how you've been taking advantage of a grieving widow. Her voice reached a pitch I'd never heard before, raw with pain and fury. Explain how my own daughter became someone I don't even recognize? That's when she said it. The words that would haunt me for months to come, the words that would set everything in motion. You want to know what I wish for my birthday, Sophia? I wish you would just disappear from my life. I wish I could pretend you never existed. I wish I could have my peace back, my money back, my trust back. My only birthday wish is that you would just leave me alone forever. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, still holding the gift I'd bought her, a vintage charm bracelet I'd found at an antique shop, each charm representing a memory we'd shared, and felt something inside me break so completely that I wondered if it could ever be repaired. Forever. I whispered. Forever, she confirmed, her voice steady now, resolved. I want you out of my house, out of my life, out of my thoughts. I'm done being disappointed by you. I'm done being hurt by you. I'm done, Sophia. We're done. I set the gift on the counter with trembling hands, next to the cake that would never be eaten, in the kitchen where I'd learned to bake, to cook, to be someone's daughter. The red velvet crumbs seemed to mock me now, sweet remnants of a relationship that had just crumbled to dust. If that's what you really want, I managed to say, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. Then that's what you'll get. I walked to the door without another word, leaving behind the cake, the gift, and 31 years of shared history. As I drove away from Elm Street for what I thought would be the last time, I caught a glimpse of her in my rearview mirror, standing in the doorway watching me go. Even from a distance, I could see the satisfaction on her face. That was the moment I decided that if Rosa Martinez wanted me to disappear, I would give her exactly what she asked for. But disappearing doesn't always mean what people think it means. Sometimes it means becoming someone else entirely. Someone stronger. Someone who doesn't need anyone's approval or love or validation. Someone capable of revenge. 3 days after my mother's birthday wish, I started planning my disappearance with the methodical precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. But here's what she didn't know, what none of them knew. I wasn't just going to vanish. I was going to become invisible in plain sight, watching from the shadows while I systematically dismantled the comfortable lies they'd all been telling themselves. If you've ever felt powerless in your own life, if you've ever wondered what it would feel like to completely reinvent yourself from the ground up, then you're about to understand exactly what drives someone to choose revenge over reconciliation. I spent those first 72 hours in a strange state of numbness, going through the motions of my normal routine while my mind raced with possibilities. I still showed up to my freelance design jobs, still responded to client emails, still paid my bills, but underneath the surface, I was planning something that would have scared the old Sofia Martinez. The Sofia who still believed in family loyalty and forgiveness and second chances. That Sofia was dead now. She died in a suburban kitchen in Portland, Oregon, killed by the words of the woman who was supposed to love her unconditionally. The first step was research. I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went, how long Miguel had been poisoning my mother against me, and what he stood to gain from destroying our relationship. So I did what any reasonable person in the digital age would do. I became a detective in my own life. It started with social media. Miguel's Facebook profile was a goldmine of information, though not in the way you might expect. His posts over the past 6 months painted a picture of someone struggling financially, someone bitter about his lot in life, someone who seemed to be spending an awful lot of time commenting on family drama that shouldn't have concerned him. But it was the private messages that really opened my eyes. I'd always been good with computers. It's how I made my living, after all, and Miguel had never been particularly careful about his digital security. It took me less than an hour to get into his email account using password recovery techniques that would make your head spin. What I found there made my stomach churn and my resolve harden into something diamond sharp. Miguel hadn't just been bad-mouthing me to my mother. He'd been systematically manipulating her for months, positioning himself as the concerned family member who only wanted to protect her from her ungrateful daughter. Email after email showed him offering to help her manage her finances, suggesting that she was being taken advantage of, slowly poisoning her mind against me with half-truths and carefully crafted lies. But the real kicker? Miguel's own financial records, carelessly stored in his email drafts, showed that he'd been skimming money from my elderly grandmother's account for over a year. The same grandmother who'd been complaining about her checks getting smaller, who'd been worrying about affording her medications, who'd been turning to my mother for financial support. Miguel had been stealing from our own family while painting me as the financial predator. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Almost. If I hadn't been so consumed with rage, I might have appreciated the poetic justice of the situation. Instead, I screenshot everything, backed it up to 3 different cloud storage accounts, and began planning phase 2 of my disappearance. Because here's the thing about revenge, it's not about getting even. It's about creating consequences that are so perfectly tailored to the crime that justice feels inevitable, natural, deserved. I started withdrawing from my old life gradually, like slowly turning down the volume on a song until it fades to silence. I stopped posting on social media. I stopped returning calls from friends who might mention seeing me to family members. I changed my phone number and gave the new one to only 3 people, my boss, my landlord, and my closest friend Jessica, who lived across the country in Chicago and had never met my family. To everyone else, Sofia Martinez was simply gone. But I wasn't gone. I was transforming. I dyed my naturally dark hair a stunning shade of auburn, learned to do my makeup in a way that subtly changed the shape of my face, and started dressing in a style that was nothing like the casual, slightly bohemian look I'd favored before. I wasn't trying to become unrecognizable. That would have been impractical and suspicious. I was trying to become forgettable, the kind of person you might glance at twice but never really see. Within 2 weeks, I looked like a completely different version of myself. More polished, more professional, more like someone who belonged in the corporate world I was about to infiltrate. Because that's when I discovered something interesting about Miguel's new position as a financial advisor at Pacific Trust Bank. The same bank where my mother had her accounts. The same bank where several elderly members of our extended family did their banking. The same bank that prided itself on integrity, security, and protecting their clients' financial well-being. The same bank that would be very, very interested to learn that one of their employees was accessing family members' accounts without authorization and helping himself to their money. But I couldn't just send an anonymous tip. That would be too easy, too impersonal. Miguel needed to understand that his actions had consequences, and my mother needed to see exactly who she'd chosen to trust over her own daughter. So I applied for a job at Pacific Trust Bank. Not as Sofia Martinez, of course. That name was too loaded now, too connected to the narrative Miguel had crafted about the unreliable, financially irresponsible family member. Instead, I became Sofia Restrepo, a name close enough to my real name that I'd naturally respond to it, but different enough that no one would immediately connect me to my family. I created an entire identity for Sofia Restrepo. New email addresses, new social media profiles, new references from carefully chosen former clients who knew me only by my freelance business name. I even got a new apartment across town, a sleek one-bedroom in a high-rise that was the complete opposite of my old cramped studio. Sofia Restrepo had an impeccable resume in financial compliance and fraud detection. She had glowing recommendations from previous employers. She had a professional wardrobe and a confident demeanor, and absolutely no connection to the Martinez family drama that had consumed the last month of my life. The interview process was almost insultingly easy. Pacific Trust Bank was desperate for qualified candidates in their compliance department, and Sofia Restrepo was exactly what they were looking for. Someone with a background in analyzing financial patterns, someone with an eye for detail, someone who could spot irregularities in account activity. Someone perfectly positioned to catch Miguel red-handed. 3 weeks after my mother told me she wished I would disappear forever, I started my new job at Pacific Trust Bank, sitting just 2 floors above Miguel's office, with full access to the systems that would reveal every fraudulent transaction he'd ever made. But I didn't rush into anything. Patience is the key to perfect revenge. Instead, I spent my first month learning the systems, earning the trust of my supervisors, and establishing myself as the thorough, detail-oriented employee who noticed things others missed. And late at night, when the office was empty and the security guards were making their rounds on other floors, I began documenting every single instance of Miguel's financial misconduct with the precision of a forensic accountant and the motivation of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to hold someone's entire future in your hands, to know that you have the power to destroy everything they've built with a single phone call, then you understand the intoxicating mixture of power and purpose that kept me working until dawn, building a case that would not only expose Miguel but vindicate everything I'd tried to tell my mother. Because the beautiful thing about financial fraud is that it leaves a digital trail. Every unauthorized access, every suspicious transfer, every time Miguel had used his position at the bank to help himself to money that wasn't his, it was all there in the system, waiting for someone with the right access and the right motivation to piece it together. And I had both. By the end of my first month at Pacific Trust Bank, I had enough evidence to send Miguel to prison for at least 5 years. But prison wasn't enough. I wanted him to lose everything the way I'd lost everything. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have the people he trusted most turn against him. I wanted him to disappear from his own life the way I'd disappeared from mine. The only question now was timing. When to pull the trigger. When to reveal Sofia Restrepo's true identity. When to show my mother exactly what kind of man she'd chosen to trust over her own daughter. But first, I had to let them think they'd won. I had to let them believe that their cruel birthday wish had actually come true, that Sofia Martinez had simply vanished from their lives like morning mist. Little did they know that I was closer than ever, watching, waiting, and preparing to give them a birthday surprise of their own. 2 months into my new life as Sofia Restrepo, I discovered something that changed everything. My mother was planning to change her will. And the primary beneficiary? Miguel. The information came to me by accident, or maybe fate has a sense of humor. I was reviewing flagged account activities in my compliance role when I noticed an unusual pattern in my mother's banking history. Large cash withdrawals, meetings with estate attorneys, transfers to investment accounts that Miguel had recommended. She wasn't just cutting me out of her life, she was systematically erasing me from her future. But here's the thing about being invisible. You see everything while everyone else stumbles around blind. I was sitting in my sterile office cubicle, surrounded by monitors displaying financial data that most people would find mind-numbingly boring, when the full scope of Miguel's plan finally revealed itself. He hadn't just wanted to turn my mother against me out of petty jealousy. He'd been positioning himself to inherit everything that should have been mine. The house on Elm Street, my father's life insurance policy, the small but significant retirement account my parents had built over 30 years of hard work. If you've ever felt the cold realization that someone you trusted has been playing a long game at your expense, that every family gathering, every shared meal, every moment of apparent affection was actually part of a calculated strategy to steal your inheritance, then you know the rage that consumed me in that moment. The bank security cameras captured me sitting perfectly still at my desk for 17 minutes, staring at the screen that displayed my mother's account activity like it held the secrets of the universe. To any observer, I probably looked like a dedicated employee carefully analyzing compliance data. In reality, I was watching my own family betray me in real time, one transaction at a time. Miguel had been thorough. I had to give him credit for that. Over the past 18 months, he'd orchestrated a masterpiece of manipulation that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. He'd isolated me from my mother gradually, planting seeds of doubt about my character and my motives. He'd positioned himself as the reliable family member, the one who visited regularly, who helped with errands, who listened to her concerns about her ungrateful daughter. And now he was cashing in on that investment. The estate attorney my mother had been meeting with was Jonathan Pierce, a man whose office was conveniently located just 3 blocks from Pacific Trust Bank. Jonathan Pierce, who specialized in elder law and had a reputation for being flexible about his clients' changing family dynamics. Jonathan Pierce, whose fees were being paid directly from my mother's account, fees that had totaled over $6,000 in the past 2 months alone. I spent my lunch break that day sitting in the parking garage of Pierce's office building, watching well-dressed people come and go, wondering which ones were there to write children out of their wills, which ones were there to ensure that family money stayed in the right hands. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was conducting surveillance from a car my mother had helped me buy, using skills I'd learned from the computer classes she'd encouraged me to take. That evening, I did something that the old Sophia would never have considered. I called Pierce's office and scheduled a consultation under Sophia Restrepo's name, claiming I was concerned about protecting my assets from family members who might challenge my will after my death. The consultation was scheduled for the following Friday afternoon. But I didn't wait for Friday to make my next move. That night, working from my apartment with the same determination I'd once applied to late-night design projects, I began phase 3 of my plan, becoming the ghost in Miguel's machine. Because here's what Miguel didn't know about his cousin Sophia. I'd been working in technology for over a decade. I understood networks, security protocols, and most importantly, human psychology. I knew that the most secure system in the world was only as strong as its weakest human component. And Miguel, for all his financial cunning, was absolutely terrible with digital security. I started small. Anonymous emails from different accounts, each one containing a single piece of information that would make him paranoid. His social security number sent from a spoofed government address. A photo of his car in the bank parking lot, timestamped and sent with no message. A list of his recent credit card transactions, delivered to his personal email from an address that looked like it came from his bank's security department. The beauty of psychological warfare is that you don't have to actually threaten someone to make them feel threatened. You just have to let them know that someone is watching, that their secrets aren't as safe as they thought, that their carefully constructed lies might be falling apart. Miguel started changing his passwords every few days. He stopped using his work computer for personal emails. He even bought a new car, probably thinking someone was tracking his movements. But he couldn't change the one thing that made him vulnerable, his guilt. Guilty people see threats everywhere because they know they deserve consequences. While Miguel was spiraling into paranoia, I was building my case with the meticulous care of someone who understood that I would only get one chance to expose him completely. Every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account access, every penny he'd stolen from my grandmother and other elderly family members, it all went into a file that grew thicker each day. But evidence wasn't enough. I needed context. I needed to understand exactly how he'd turned my mother against me, what lies he'd told, what promises he'd made. I needed to hear it in his own words. That's when I remembered something my father had taught me years ago, back when he was worried about potential break-ins at the store he managed. The best security system, he'd said, is the one people don't know exists. Miguel's office at the bank was on the third floor, in a section that had been renovated the previous year. New carpets, new lighting, new everything, including a state-of-the-art phone system that recorded calls for quality assurance and training purposes. A system that Sofia Restrepo, as a compliance officer, had legitimate access to review. It took me 2 weeks of careful listening, reviewing hours of recorded calls during my official work hours, before I found what I was looking for. A conversation between Miguel and someone named Carlos, another family member I barely knew, from 3 months earlier. The old lady is finally starting to see what everyone else has known for years. Miguel's voice came through the speakers with crystal clarity. Sofia's a leech. Always has been. The only reason she kept helping her was guilt over the dead husband. Rosa's got money though, right? Carlos asked. Like, real money? More than you'd think. The house is worth at least 400 grand, plus insurance money, plus retirement accounts. She's sitting on close to 700,000, and Sofia was set to inherit all of it. Miguel's laugh made my blood run cold. Not anymore. I've been working on this for over a year, man. Showing Rosa bank statements, pointing out inconsistencies, making sure she understands that Sofia's been using her. By the time I'm done, Rosa won't just cut her out of the will, she'll actively hate her. And then I become the son she never had. The reliable family member who was there when her real daughter abandoned her. Carlos, we're talking about enough money to change our lives. Split 3 ways between you, me, and maybe one of the other cousins. We're looking at over 200 grand each. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely work the computer controls. There it was, recorded in Miguel's own voice, the complete confession to a year-long plan to steal my inheritance by systematically destroying my relationship with my mother. And he wasn't working alone. If you've ever discovered that multiple family members have been conspiring against you, plotting to steal from you while smiling to your face at family gatherings, then you understand the particular kind of rage that feels like ice water in your veins. Cold, clarifying, and absolutely unforgiving. I made 17 copies of that recording. I uploaded it to secure cloud storage. I burned it to CDs and stored them in 3 different safety deposit boxes across the city. I even mailed copies to myself at different addresses, ensuring that no matter what happened, that conversation would survive. But I still wasn't ready to play my hand. Because by this point, I'd realized that simply exposing Miguel wouldn't be enough. I'd been erased from my mother's life based on lies, and simply revealing those lies wouldn't undo the damage. She'd chosen to believe Miguel over me. She'd chosen to cut me out of her will and her heart based on manufactured evidence. She needed to experience consequences too. The consultation with Jonathan Pierce confirmed my worst fears and gave me my best opportunity. Sitting in his mahogany-paneled office, pretending to be Sofia Restrepo seeking legal advice about protecting assets from family members, I listened as he casually mentioned that he specialized in helping clients restructure their family relationships through strategic estate planning. Sometimes, he said with practiced sympathy, parents need to make difficult decisions about children who haven't lived up to their expectations. It's more common than you might think. When I asked about a hypothetical situation involving a daughter who had been financially irresponsible, Pierce nodded knowingly. I have a client right now dealing with exactly that situation. She's finally realized that her daughter has been taking advantage of her generosity, and she wants to ensure her assets go to family members who will appreciate them. He was talking about my mother. casually discussing her private business with a complete stranger, violating attorney-client privilege while congratulating himself on helping her make the right choice. That's when I knew that Pierce would be collateral damage in my war against Miguel. Because anyone who would betray their client's confidentiality to impress a potential new client deserved whatever consequences came their way. By the time I left Pierce's office, I had a complete picture of the conspiracy against me. Miguel, Carlos, possibly other family members, and even my mother's attorney, all working together to ensure that Sofia Martinez not only disappeared from my mother's life, but was erased from her legacy as well. They thought they'd won. They thought the weak, financially dependent daughter they'd constructed in their minds had simply crawled away to lick her wounds, probably living paycheck to paycheck and regretting the loss of her mother's support. They had no idea that Sofia Martinez had died in that kitchen on my mother's birthday, and that Sofia Restrepo had been born from her ashes with a very specific purpose: to make every single person who had betrayed me pay a price so steep they'd spend the rest of their lives regretting their choices. The ghost in their machine was about to become very, very real. For months after my mother wished me out of existence, I had become something I never thought possible: a weapon disguised as a woman named Sofia Restrepo. But the most dangerous part of my transformation wasn't my new identity or my access to the bank systems. It was the patience I'd learned to cultivate like a fine wine, letting it age until the perfect moment to uncork it. If you've ever had to watch the people who hurt you continue living their lives as if nothing happened, celebrating victories built on your destruction, then you understand why patience becomes both torture and salvation. By December, Miguel had been promoted to senior financial advisor at Pacific Trust Bank. The promotion came with a salary increase, a corner office, and most importantly, access to even more client accounts. He was practically glowing with success, posting photos on social media of his new office, his new car, his weekend trips to Seattle and San Francisco funded by money that should have been my grandmother's medication fund. My mother, meanwhile, had become a regular presence at family gatherings that I now only heard about through careful social media surveillance. Pictures of her smiling with Miguel and Carlos, looking healthier and happier than she had since my father's death. Looking like a woman who had finally rid herself of a burden she'd been carrying for too long. The pictures hurt more than I'd expected them to. Seeing her laugh at what was probably one of Miguel's jokes, seeing her wear the earrings I'd given her for Mother's Day the year before, seeing her surrounded by family members who were actively stealing from her while positioning themselves as her protectors, it was like watching someone you love fall in love with their own killer. But pain, I'd learned, could be refined into something much more useful: focus. I'd been documenting everything for months, but documentation was just the foundation. What I needed now was the perfect moment, the opportunity that would allow me to detonate the truth with maximum impact while ensuring that every guilty party faced appropriate consequences. That opportunity came in the form of my mother's 68th birthday. According to the family group chat that I'd been monitoring through Carlos's hilariously insecure Facebook account, Miguel was planning a surprise party at the house on Elm Street. A celebration of Rosa Martinez's new lease on life, her freedom from toxic family relationships, her bright future with the family members who truly cared about her. The party was scheduled for January 15th, a Saturday afternoon when the Pacific Northwest winter light would be fading early and the house would be warm with laughter and lies. I spent 2 weeks planning my attendance at that party. Not as Sofia Restrepo, who had no reason to be there, and not as the broken daughter who'd been banished from her family. I was going to attend as something else entirely, the recording angel who'd been documenting every sin, every betrayal, every stolen dollar for the past 4 months. But first, I had one more ghost to lay to rest. Jonathan Pierce's law office had been closed for 3 weeks by the time January rolled around. The Oregon State Bar had suspended his license pending an investigation into allegations of financial misconduct, elder abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty. The allegations had been filed by an anonymous whistleblower who'd somehow obtained recordings of Pierce discussing his client's private business with unauthorized third parties. The same whistleblower had also provided evidence that Pierce had been steering elderly clients toward investment strategies that paid him undisclosed commissions, essentially profiting from their trust while claiming to protect their interests. Pierce's professional reputation was destroyed overnight. His practice was shuttered. His wealthy clients fled to more reputable attorneys, taking their substantial fees with them. The man who'd helped my mother rewrite her will to exclude me was now fighting to avoid criminal charges that could send him to prison for elder fraud. Sometimes the universe has a sense of poetic justice that even the most carefully planned revenge can improve upon. With Pierce out of the picture, my mother's was back in legal limbo. She'd have to start over with a new attorney, re-establish her intentions, recreate the legal documents that would have ensured Miguel inherited everything that should have been mine. But she didn't know that yet.
None of them did.
The morning of the party, I drove past the house on Elm Street 3 times, watching cars arrive, seeing familiar faces carry covered dishes and wrapped presents toward the front door. The same door where my mother had told me she wished I would disappear forever. The same door I was about to walk through one last time. I parked 6 blocks away and walked through the neighborhood where I'd grown up, past houses where I'd played as a child, past the corner where I'd waited for the school bus every morning for 12 years. The January air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke from chimneys and the promise of rain that never seemed to leave Portland's winter sky. I looked nothing like the Sofia Martinez who'd last walked these streets. My auburn hair was styled in a sleek bob that brushed my shoulders. My makeup was flawless, applied with the precision of someone who'd spent months learning to reshape her own face with contouring and highlighting. My clothes were expensive, not ostentatious, but clearly costly, the kind of outfit that suggested success and confidence. But most importantly, I carried myself differently. Gone was the slightly uncertain posture of someone who'd spent her adult life asking for approval. Sofia Restrepo walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was worth and wasn't afraid to demand it. I knocked on the front door at exactly 4:30, timing my arrival for maximum dramatic impact. The party would be in full swing, people would be relaxed and off guard, and my mother would be surrounded by the family members who'd convinced her that cutting me out of her life was an act of self-preservation. Miguel answered the door, and for a moment, his face registered confusion. He knew he should recognize me, but the changes I'd made were just subtle enough to create cognitive dissonance. I looked familiar but wrong, like a song played in a different key. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. "I'm here for Rosa Martinez's birthday party," I said, my voice pitched slightly lower than my natural register, refined by months of speech coaching videos I'd watched online. "I work with her at the hospital." It was a lie so perfect it was almost true. Rosa had mentioned her new job at Portland General in her social media posts, the part-time administrative position she'd taken after Pierce convinced her she needed additional income to fund her legal fees. Miguel had no reason to question my connection to her work life, especially since my new appearance suggested exactly the kind of professional colleague his aunt might have met at her job. "Oh, of course," Miguel said, stepping aside to let me in. "She's in the kitchen." "I'm Miguel, her nephew." "Sofia," I replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that spoke of confidence and success. "Rosa talks about you all the time." The lie rolled off my tongue like honey, sweet and believable. Miguel's chest puffed up with pride, exactly as I'd expected. He loved being the favored family member, the one Rosa bragged about to her coworkers. The house looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. The hallway that had once welcomed me home now felt like foreign territory, every family photo a reminder of the life I'd been excised from. But I wasn't the same person who'd been hurt by those images 4 months ago. I was someone who understood that sentiment was a luxury I couldn't afford. The kitchen was crowded with family members I recognized, but who no longer recognized me. My mother stood at the center of it all, wearing a beautiful red sweater I'd never seen before, looking younger and happier than she had in years. She was laughing at something Carlos was saying, her eyes bright with genuine joy. It occurred to me that maybe she really was happier without me in her life. Maybe Miguel and Carlos had genuinely convinced her that I'd been a burden she was better off without. Maybe, in her mind, she'd made the right choice. The thought should have given me pause. The old Sofia might have seen her mother's happiness and wondered if the revenge she'd spent months planning was really necessary. But Sofia Restrepo understood something that the old Sofia never had. Happiness built on lies is just another kind of prison, and the people trapped inside it deserve to know the truth about their captivity. "Rosa," Miguel called from behind me. "There's someone here to see you." My mother turned, and for just a moment, I saw recognition flicker in her eyes. Not conscious recognition. The changes I'd made were too complete for that, but something deeper. The way a mother's body remembers her child even when her mind doesn't immediately make the connection. "Sophia," I said, extending my hand. "From Portland General. Happy birthday." She shook my hand with genuine warmth, her smile reaching her eyes in a way that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Oh, how wonderful that you came. Miguel, get Sophia a drink. Are you hungry? There's so much food." This was the mother I remembered from childhood. Warm, welcoming, insistent that everyone around her was fed and comfortable. The mother who'd raised me to believe that family meant unconditional love and support. The mother who'd wished me out of existence 4 months ago based on lies and manipulated evidence. I accepted a glass of wine and let myself be drawn into the party, making conversation with family members who had no idea they were talking to the ghost they'd helped create. It was surreal, standing in the living room where I'd opened Christmas presents for 30 years, listening to people discuss what a relief it was that Rosa had finally freed herself from her problematic daughter. It was such a difficult decision for her, I heard my cousin Maria say to another relative. But Sophia had become so demanding, so manipulative. Miguel really opened her eyes to what was happening. "I always wondered about that girl," came the reply from my great-aunt Carmen. Something wasn't right about her. The way she kept asking for money while claiming to be independent. I sipped my wine and nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the concerned coworker who was just learning about her colleagues' family struggles. Inside, I was cataloging every comment, every casual character assassination, every person who'd chosen to believe Miguel's narrative without ever asking for my side of the story. If you've ever been in a room full of people casually discussing your supposed character flaws while you stand there invisible, listening to them justify your exile from your own family, then you understand the unique form of psychological torture that masquerades as enlightenment. Every word was a knife, but also evidence. Every casual cruelty was motivation refined into diamond-hard purpose. The party reached its peak around 6 o'clock, when Miguel stood up to make a toast. He tapped his wine glass with a fork, calling for attention in the same living room where my father used to tell bedtime stories, where I'd practiced piano recitals, where I'd announced my college acceptance and my first job and every milestone that had mattered in my life. "I want to say something about Tia Rosa," Miguel began, his voice carrying the practiced sincerity of someone who'd learned to weaponize empathy. "This year has been difficult for her. She had to make some hard choices about family, about loyalty, about what she deserved in her golden years." The room fell silent, wine glasses suspended halfway to lips, everyone understanding that this toast was about more than just my mother's birthday. "But look at her now," Miguel continued, gesturing toward my mother with theatrical warmth. "Free from stress, surrounded by family who genuinely care about her, able to enjoy her life without constantly worrying about people who were taking advantage of her generosity." My mother's eyes filled with tears, happy tears, grateful tears, tears of a woman who believed she'd been rescued from her own daughter's manipulation. "To Tia Rosa," Miguel raised his glass higher, "and to family members who tell the truth, even when it's painful, even when it means making difficult decisions. Here's to honesty, loyalty, and the courage to cut toxic people out of our lives." The room erupted in agreement. To Rosa, they chorused, glasses clinking, people hugging, everyone celebrating the successful amputation of Sofia Martinez from the family body. I raised my glass with everyone else, toasting my own exile with a smile that felt like it might crack my face in half. Because this was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the perfect setup for the revelation that would destroy everything Miguel had built. But first, I had a toast of my own to make. I cleared my throat and stepped forward slightly, drawing attention with the confidence that Sofia Restrepo had perfected over months of practice. "If I may," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "I'd like to add something to that toast." Miguel looked surprised but pleased. Another family member wanting to celebrate his success, to validate his version of events. Rosa, I continued, looking directly at my mother. You raised your daughter to believe that family meant unconditional love. That blood was thicker than water. That no matter what happened, no matter what mistakes were made, family would always be there for each other. My mother nodded, smiling through her tears. That's what family should be, she agreed. And you're right, I said, pulling out my phone with the casual gesture of someone about to share photos. Family should tell the truth, even when it's painful, even when it reveals things that are difficult to accept. I pressed play on the audio file I'd prepared, and Miguel's voice filled the living room with crystal clarity. The old lady is finally starting to see what everyone else has known for years. Sophia's a leech. Always has been. The only reason she kept helping her was guilt over the dead husband. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye in the room turned to Miguel, whose face had gone white as paper. But I wasn't done. Rosa's got money though, right? Like, real money? More than you'd think. The house is worth at least 400 grand, plus insurance money, plus retirement accounts. She's sitting on close to 700,000, and Sophia was set to inherit all of it. My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor Dad had installed 20 years ago. The sound was like a gunshot in the deathly quiet room. I've been working on this for over a year, man. Showing Rosa bank statements, pointing out inconsistencies, making sure she understands that Sophia's been using her. By the time I'm done, Rosa won't just cut her out of the will, she'll actively hate her. That's when I saw the exact moment my mother's world collapsed. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, horror, devastation, like watching someone age 10 years in 10 seconds. And then I become the son she never had. The reliable family member who was there when her real daughter abandoned her. Carlos, we're talking about enough money to change our lives. Carlos, who'd been standing near the kitchen door, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Split 3 ways between you, me, and maybe one of the other cousins. We're looking at over 200 grand each. I let the recording play until the end, until Miguel's laughter filled the room with the sound of pure greed and calculated manipulation. Then I turned off my phone and slipped it back into my purse with the calm precision of someone who'd just performed surgery. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same clock that had marked time through every important moment of my childhood. Rosa, I said quietly, my voice now pitched in its natural register, I want you to know that everything Miguel told you about my bank account was true. I did have $3,000 in savings. $3,000 that I'd scraped together over 2 years of freelance work. $3,000 that represented every penny I hadn't spent on rent or food or basic necessities. $3,000 that I was saving for the down payment on a car because mine was 15 years old and breaking down every other month. My mother was staring at me with growing recognition, her mind finally connecting the voice to the face she'd known for 31 years. I never lied to you about struggling. I never manipulated you for money. Every time I asked for help, it was because I genuinely needed it, and every time you gave it, I was grateful in ways I apparently never expressed well enough. My voice started to shake, but I pushed through it. I loved you. I trusted you. And when you told me your birthday wish was for me to disappear from your life, I thought I was giving you what you wanted. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of family members who were beginning to understand the scope of what they'd participated in. But disappearing doesn't always mean what people think it means. Sometimes it means becoming someone else. Someone who can see clearly. Someone who can document the truth. Someone who can make sure that lies have consequences. Miguel finally found his voice. Rosa, I can explain. No, my mother said, the words sharp enough to cut glass. No, you can't. What happened next in that living room was like watching a family implode in slow motion, each revelation hitting like a controlled detonation designed to bring down the entire structure of lies Miguel had spent over a year constructing. Miguel tried to salvage the situation with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. Tia Rosa, you have to understand, I was just venting to Carlos. You never meant to get caught. I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority of someone who held all the cards. But meaning and intention are luxuries you forfeited when you decided to steal from your own family. I pulled out a manila folder from my purse, the same type of folder my mother had used to present her case against me 4 months earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Miguel, would you like to explain to everyone how you've been accessing Abuela Carmen's account without authorization for the past 14 months? Or should I play the recording of you bragging to Carlos about how easy it was to convince an 83-year-old woman that her memory was failing when her bank statements didn't match what she expected? My grandmother, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner armchair, suddenly looked alert and focused. Miguel? What is she talking about? The color drained from Miguel's face so completely I thought he might faint. He'd been stealing from our grandmother, a woman who'd raised 5 children during the Depression, who'd worked as a seamstress for 60 years to save every penny for her retirement, who trusted family above everything else in the world. I have copies of every unauthorized transaction, I continued, spreading bank statements across the coffee table like a dealer laying out cards. 17 separate instances over 14 months. A total of $8,437 stolen from a woman who was skipping her blood pressure medication because she thought she couldn't afford it. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and angry questions, but I wasn't finished. This was my moment, the culmination of months of careful planning and patient documentation, and I was going to make sure every truth was revealed. Carlos, I said, turning to my cousin who'd been trying to edge toward the door, would you like to tell everyone about your role in this? Or should I explain how you've been Miguel's accomplice, helping him identify which family members had the most money and the least family oversight? Carlos froze like a deer in headlights. I didn't know he was stealing. I thought we were just looking out for the family's interests. You thought you were positioning yourselves to inherit money that didn't belong to you, I corrected. Which brings us to the most interesting part of this story. I pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Oregon State Bar. Jonathan Pierce, the attorney who helped my mother rewrite her will to exclude me, is currently under investigation for elder fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against senior citizens. His license has been suspended, and all wills he's prepared in the past 2 years are under legal review. My mother sank into her chair like the air had been let out of her. The will isn't valid? The will that would have given Miguel power of attorney over your finances and made him the primary beneficiary of your estate was prepared by a lawyer who is essentially running a scam targeting elderly clients. So no, it's not valid. But more importantly, Mom, you need to understand why Pierce was so eager to help you cut me out of your inheritance. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, a contract between Pierce and Miguel that I discovered during my deep dive into Pierce's email records. Pierce was paying Miguel a finder's fee for every client over 65 that he referred to the practice. 10% of whatever Pierce made in legal fees, plus an additional bonus if the client had assets worth more than $500,000. I looked directly at Miguel. You made over $6,000 just for convincing my mother that she needed to change her will. The silence in the room was deafening. Family members who had been celebrating my exile 20 minutes earlier were now staring at Miguel with expressions ranging from disgust to horror. The golden child, the reliable nephew who'd opened everyone's eyes to Sophia's true nature, was revealed as the architect of an elaborate con game targeting his own elderly relatives. But I still wasn't done. Because the most beautiful thing about perfect revenge is that it doesn't just expose the crime, it reveals the character of everyone who participated in it. I want everyone in this room to think about something, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. How many of you heard Miguel's version of events about me and never once thought to ask for my side of the story? How many of you were so eager to believe that I was a manipulative leech that you didn't question why a daughter who'd never asked for anything but occasional help with rent would suddenly become a master manipulator? The uncomfortable shifting in the room told me everything I needed to know. They'd wanted to believe Miguel's story because it was easier than examining their own relationship with money, family, and obligation. How many of you, I continued, have been struggling financially yourselves and were relieved to hear that someone else in the family was the problem? That Rose's generosity wasn't something you needed to worry about matching because her ungrateful daughter was already taking advantage of it. My cousin Maria had tears in her eyes. Sophia, we didn't know. You didn't want to know, I corrected gently but firmly. You wanted someone to blame for the fact that Rosa seemed stressed about money, that she was working more hours, that she was worried about her future. It was easier to believe that her daughter was the problem than to examine whether you were all doing enough to support an elderly woman who'd been generous to this family for decades. That's when my mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you known about all of this? I started figuring it out about 3 months ago, I admitted. But it took time to get the evidence, to understand the full scope of what Miguel had orchestrated, to document everything in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. 3 months, she repeated, and I could see her mind working, calculating. You've known for 3 months that he'd been lying to me, and you didn't tell me? This was the question I'd been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of my own choices over the past 4 months. Because the truth was, I could have exposed Miguel much earlier. I could have presented this evidence to my mother weeks after she'd banished me from her life. But I hadn't. I'd let her continue believing that I was the problem. I'd let her suffer the guilt and stress of thinking she'd made a necessary but painful decision about her daughter. I'd let her live with lies because I'd wanted her to understand what it felt like to be betrayed by someone she trusted. I could have told you earlier, I said finally. But I wanted you to experience what it felt like to have your reality manipulated by someone you trusted. I wanted you to understand what it was like to make decisions based on lies. I wanted you to know what I felt like when you chose to believe Miguel over me without ever asking for my side of the story. The hurt in her eyes was immediate and devastating. So this is revenge? You let me suffer for months as revenge. No, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. This is justice. Revenge would have been letting Miguel drain your accounts and disappear with your money. Revenge would have been letting you discover his theft after he'd cleaned you out and moved to another state. Revenge would have been watching from the sidelines while your trust in family destroyed your financial security. I walked over to her chair and knelt beside it, looking directly into the eyes that had once looked at me with unconditional love. I spent 4 months becoming someone who could protect you from the people you chose to trust over me. I got a job at Miguel's bank. I documented his crimes. I built a case that will not only get your money back, but will send him to prison for elder fraud. I became Sofia Restrepo so that Sofia Martinez could save her mother from her own poor judgment. The room was completely silent except for the sound of my grandmother crying, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief as she finally understood why her bank account never seemed to match what she thought it should. Everything I did, I continued, I did to protect this family from the predator you all invited to the table. Miguel didn't just steal money. He stole trust, security, and peace of mind from elderly people who believed that family meant safety. I stood up and faced the room full of family members who were slowly beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been happening right under their noses. The evidence I've gathered has been turned over to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the Oregon Department of Justice Elder Abuse Unit, and the bank's internal fraud investigation team. Miguel will be arrested within the next 48 hours. The money he stole will be returned to its rightful owners, with interest and penalties paid by the bank for failing to detect the fraud earlier. Miguel, who'd been standing frozen near the kitchen door, suddenly bolted for the exit. But I'd anticipated that possibility. As he reached for the doorknob, it turned from the outside, and 2 FBI agents entered the house with the calm professionalism of people who'd done this many times before. Miguel Santos? The lead agent asked, though it was clearly a formality. Miguel nodded mutely, the fight completely gone out of him. You're under arrest for bank fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent. As the agents read Miguel his rights and placed him in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a profound sense of sadness for the family we'd all lost in this process. The trust that would never be fully restored. The relationships that would never recover from the knowledge of how easily we'd all been manipulated. But mostly, I felt sad for the daughter who died in this kitchen 4 months ago, the one who'd believed that family love was unconditional and that trust, once broken, could always be repaired. That daughter was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more capable of protecting herself and the people she loved from those who would exploit their generosity. As Miguel was led away in handcuffs and the FBI agents began interviewing the elderly family members who'd been victimized by his schemes, I realized that my disappearance was complete. I'd successfully vanished from the life my mother thought she wanted, but I'd reappeared as someone she never could have imagined, her own protector, disguised as her enemy. The question now was whether Sofia Restrepo could find a way to coexist with the mother who'd wished Sofia Martinez out of existence, or whether some betrayals create damage too profound for even perfect justice to repair. The FBI agents finished their preliminary interviews and left with promises to return the next day for more detailed statements, taking with them copies of all the evidence I'd spent months collecting. The house on Elm Street felt hollow after their departure, like a crime scene where the yellow tape had been removed, but the trauma lingered in every corner. Most of the family members had made awkward excuses and left shortly after Miguel's arrest, carrying covered dishes and unwrapped birthday presents in a procession of shame and discomfort. Nobody quite knew how to process what they'd witnessed, how to reconcile the nephew they'd trusted with the criminal who'd been handcuffed in their presence. If you've ever watched the foundations of your family's reality crumble in real time, if you've ever seen people you've known your entire life struggle to understand how they could have been so completely deceived, then you understand the particular kind of exhaustion that settled over that living room like fog. By 8 o'clock, only my mother, my grandmother, Carlos, and I remained. Carlos sat in the corner looking like he was waiting for his own arrest, while Abuela Carmen held my hand with the grip of someone who'd finally found solid ground after months of feeling like her memory and judgment were failing her. I knew something was wrong with my account, she kept repeating, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Miguel kept telling me I was confused, that I was forgetting things, but I knew. I've been managing money for 70 years. I knew. The gaslighting Miguel had subjected our grandmother to was perhaps the cruelest part of his scheme. Convincing an elderly woman that her mental faculties were declining when she was actually detecting his theft had robbed her of more than money. It had stolen her confidence in her own mind. Carlos finally broke his silence around 8:30. "I never touched anyone's money," he said, his voice small and defensive. I helped Miguel figure out who in the family might have savings. I thought we were protecting them from making bad financial decisions. You thought you were positioning yourselves to inherit money that didn't belong to you, I replied, too tired for anger. The FBI has recordings of you discussing how to divide up Rosa's assets after she died. They have emails where you helped Miguel identify which elderly family members lived alone and might be vulnerable to manipulation. Will I be arrested too? Carlos asked, and for the first time since I'd started planning this revenge, I felt something approaching pity for one of my targets. Probably, I said honestly. But cooperating with the investigation, returning any money you received from Miguel, and testifying against him might reduce the charges. Carlos nodded miserably and left shortly after, promising to contact the FBI in the morning. That left just 3 generations of Martinez women in the living room where I'd opened Christmas presents as a child, trying to figure out how to rebuild trust that had been shattered by months of manipulation and lies. My mother hadn't spoken directly to me since learning that I'd known the truth for months without telling her. She'd answered the FBI agents' questions, comforted my grandmother, played the role of the shocked victim with grace and dignity. But every time her eyes met mine, I saw the same question. How could you let me suffer like that? It was my grandmother who finally addressed the elephant in the room. Rosa, she said, her voice carrying the authority of the family matriarch, you need to understand something about what your daughter did. She didn't just expose Miguel's crimes. She spent months of her life, changed everything about herself, got a job at his bank, and built a case that will make sure he goes to prison and we get our money back. My mother's jaw tightened. She also let me believe for months that I'd made the right decision cutting her out of my life. She let me think I was protecting myself from manipulation while I was actually being manipulated by someone else. Because you wouldn't have believed her if she'd just told you, my grandmother replied with the blunt honesty that comes with age. Miguel spent a year convincing you that Sophia was a liar. If she'd walked in here 3 months ago with bank statements and recordings, what would you have done? The question hung in the air like smoke. We all knew the answer. 3 months ago, my mother would have assumed I'd fabricated evidence, that I was trying to manipulate her into doubting Miguel's warnings about my character. I would have thought she was lying, my mother admitted quietly. I would have thought it was exactly the kind of thing Miguel warned me about. So she became someone you would believe, my grandmother continued. She became Sophia Restrepo, a professional you respected, someone with no reason to lie to you. Someone who could present evidence in a way that couldn't be dismissed as the desperate manipulation of a cut-off daughter. I hadn't expected my grandmother to understand the psychology behind my choices so clearly, but then again, she'd lived through 83 years of human nature. She understood that sometimes the truth has to be disguised to be heard. But the pain I went through, my mother said, her voice breaking slightly. The guilt, the second-guessing, the loneliness. She let me suffer through all of that when she could have ended it. The pain you went through, I said quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time since revealing my identity, was nothing compared to what Miguel was planning to put you through. If I'd exposed him earlier, before I had complete evidence, before I understood the full scope of his plan, he might have found ways to cover his tracks. He might have convinced you that I was setting him up, that I was the real threat. I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot I'd hoped I'd never have to use. This is an email Miguel sent to Carlos 2 weeks ago. He was getting impatient with how long it was taking you to finalize your new will. He was considering ways to accelerate your decline, maybe convincing you that you had early-stage dementia, so he could get power of attorney sooner. My mother's face went white as she read Miguel's casual discussion of psychological manipulation tactics that would have destroyed her sense of reality entirely. He was planning to gaslight you into believing you were losing your mind. I continued. The 4 months of discomfort you experienced thinking you'd made a hard but necessary decision about your daughter were nothing compared to the years of confusion and helplessness he was planning to put you through. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of understanding. My mother was finally grasping that the choice wasn't between comfort and discomfort, but between short-term pain with long-term justice and short-term relief with catastrophic consequences. How did you know? She asked finally. How did you know to become Sophia Restrepo instead of just fighting back as yourself? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating for months. The answer revealed something about myself that I wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. Because I've been watching people manipulate you my entire life, I said. Dad was gentle about it, but he learned early in your marriage that you responded better to suggestions than direct confrontation. Miguel figured out the same thing. Even Pierce understood that you needed to feel like decisions were your idea, not something being forced on you. My mother looked hurt by the observation, but my grandmother nodded knowingly. It's not a weakness, Mija, my grandmother told her. It's just how you process information. You need time to think things through, to come to conclusions on your own terms. Sophia understood that the only way to protect you was to present the truth in a way that would let you discover it yourself. But it feels like manipulation, my mother said. It feels like everyone in my life has been trying to control me, including my own daughter. There's a difference, I said, and this was the crucial distinction that had guided every choice I'd made over the past 4 months. Miguel manipulated you to steal from you. Pierce manipulated you to profit from you. I manipulated the situation to protect you from them. The methods might look similar, but the intentions and outcomes are completely different. It was a fine moral line, and I wasn't entirely sure I was on the right side of it. But the alternative, watching my mother become the victim of a long-term financial and psychological con game, had been unacceptable. So what happens now? My mother asked. Between us, I mean. Are you Sophia Restrepo permanently? Is Sofia Martinez really gone? The question cut to the heart of everything I'd been avoiding thinking about for months.
Who was I now?
Could I go back to being Rosa Martinez's daughter after everything that had happened? Did I want to? I don't know, I admitted. Sofia Martinez was someone who believed that family love was unconditional, that trust once given would be protected, that telling the truth was always the right choice. Sofia Restrepo is someone who understands that love requires boundaries, that trust has to be earned continuously, and that sometimes the truth needs strategic packaging to be effective. I looked around the living room where I'd learned those first lessons about family love, where I'd believed for 31 years that blood was thicker than water and that home was a place where you could always return. I can't unknow what I know now, I continued. I can't go back to believing that you'll choose me over people who sound more convincing. I can't pretend that you didn't wish me out of your life without ever asking for my side of the story. And I can't forget that it took months of strategic manipulation to make you trust me enough to hear the truth. My mother started crying then, not the angry tears of betrayal, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of grief. She was mourning the loss of the relationship we'd had before, the simple trust that could never be fully restored. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I believed him over you. I'm sorry I never asked for your side. I'm sorry I made that horrible birthday wish." I moved to sit beside her on the couch, close enough to offer comfort, but not close enough to pretend that everything was forgiven. "I know you are," I said. "And I'm sorry I let you suffer when I could have ended it sooner. I'm sorry I chose justice over mercy. I'm sorry that protecting you required becoming someone you don't recognize." My grandmother watched us both with the patient wisdom of someone who'd seen families fracture and heal over decades of shared history. "You're both different people now," she observed. "Rosa, you're not the woman who trusted everyone at face value anymore. Sofia, you're not the daughter who believed love meant never having to prove your worth. The question isn't whether you can go back to who you were before. You can't. The question is whether the people you've become can build something new together." It was the most profound thing anyone had said all day, and it reframed everything I'd been struggling with. I couldn't resurrect Sofia Martinez any more than my mother could return to the naive trust she'd possessed before Miguel's manipulation. But Sofia Restrepo and this wiser, warier version of Rosa Martinez might be able to create a relationship based on realistic expectations instead of fantasy ideals. "What would that look like?" my mother asked, echoing my own thoughts. "I don't know," I admitted. "But maybe it starts with both of us accepting that what we had before is gone, and deciding whether we want to build something different in its place." Outside, it had started raining, the gentle, persistent rain that defines Portland winters and washes everything clean. Inside, 3 women who'd been changed by betrayal, manipulation, and the complicated mathematics of family loyalty sat in the ruins of their old relationships and tried to imagine what new ones might look like. The revenge was complete. Justice had been served. Miguel would pay for his crimes, the stolen money would be returned, and the truth had finally been revealed in all its devastating clarity. But the hardest part was just beginning. Figuring out how to live with the consequences of choices made in the name of protection, and whether love could survive the kind of strategic thinking it had taken to preserve it. 6 weeks after Miguel's arrest, I sat in a federal courthouse watching him plea bargain his way to a 7-year prison sentence while I tried to figure out whether the woman I'd become in pursuit of justice was someone I actually wanted to live with for the rest of my life. The courtroom was nearly empty except for the lawyers, a few family members, and me, still presenting as Sofia Restrepo for legal purposes, since that's the identity under which I'd gathered most of the evidence. Miguel's defense attorney had advised him to accept the plea deal rather than risk a trial that could have resulted in 15 years. 7 years for elder fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy, and theft. 7 years that would essentially destroy his career, his reputation, and any chance he had of rebuilding the life he'd tried to steal from his own family. As the judge accepted his plea and outlined the terms of his sentence, Miguel turned around and looked directly at me. Not with anger or hatred, but with something that looked almost like respect. He'd finally figured out who Sofia Restrepo really was, and I think he was impressed despite himself by the completeness of his destruction. If you've ever watched someone who tried to destroy you face the consequences of their actions, if you've ever sat in a courtroom where justice was finally being served after months of lies and manipulation, then you understand why that moment felt both triumphant and hollow. The victory was perfect. Miguel would serve real time. The bank had returned every stolen penny to its rightful owners, plus interest and penalties. Carlos had received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation and testimony. Jonathan Pierce was facing his own criminal charges in a separate case. Everyone who had participated in the conspiracy against my family was facing appropriate consequences. But perfect justice, I was learning, doesn't automatically restore what was lost. It doesn't undo the months of pain my grandmother experienced thinking her memory was failing. It doesn't erase the guilt my mother felt for cutting me out of her life. And it doesn't bring back the daughter who died in that kitchen on her mother's birthday, replaced by someone harder and more calculating. After the sentencing, I drove to the house on Elm Street for what had become our weekly dinner, a tentative tradition my mother and I had established as we tried to build something new from the wreckage of what we'd lost. These dinners were careful affairs, full of polite conversation and cautious emotional territory mapping, like two diplomats negotiating a peace treaty between countries that had been at war. My grandmother was already there when I arrived, setting the table with the good china we'd only used for special occasions when I was growing up. She'd recovered remarkably well from Miguel's psychological manipulation, but she'd also become fiercely protective of the family's remaining trust. Nobody made financial decisions anymore without running them past Abuela Carmen first. "How did it go today?" my mother asked as I hung my coat in the hallway, past the family photos that had been turned face down during my exile and were now displayed again, but somehow different. The pictures looked the same, but the stories they told had changed completely. 7 years, I said. He'll serve at least 5 with good behavior. Good, my grandmother said with the satisfaction of someone who believed in consequences. He should have gotten more, but at least he won't be stealing from anyone else's family for a long time. My mother nodded, but didn't say anything. She'd been struggling with mixed feelings about Miguel's punishment, relieved that justice was being served, but also grieving for the nephew she thought she'd known. It's complicated to celebrate someone's downfall when you genuinely cared about the person you thought they were. We sat down to dinner, arroz con pollo, the same recipe my grandmother had been making for 60 years, and tried to navigate the strange new dynamic we'd created. I was still technically Sofia Restrepo in most aspects of my life. The job at the bank, the apartment across town, the professional wardrobe and refined speech patterns, all of that remained because returning to my old life felt impossible now. But in this kitchen during these weekly dinners, I was slowly becoming someone new. Not the old Sofia Martinez, who'd been too trusting and dependent, but not the calculating Sofia Restrepo either. Someone in between. Someone who understood that love required strategy, but refused to let strategy replace love entirely. "I got a call from a lawyer today," my mother said as we ate. "Someone representing the bank, where Miguel worked. They want to interview me about something called victim impact testimony for their internal investigation." The bank was conducting its own review of how Miguel had been able to operate his scheme for over a year without detection. Heads were rolling in their compliance department, security protocols were being overhauled, and they were trying to minimize their liability by demonstrating their cooperation with law enforcement. "Are you going to do it?" I asked. "I think so. They said it might help other families who went through similar situations." She looked at me carefully. "They also asked if I thought my daughter would be willing to participate, since your investigation was so thorough." This was the question that had been hanging over us for weeks. My role in exposing Miguel's crimes had made me something of a folk hero in certain circles, the daughter who'd fought back against family financial fraud, the woman who'd reinvented herself to protect her elderly relatives. Several organizations had reached out asking me to speak about elder financial abuse, to consult on family fraud cases, to turn my experience into advocacy work. But all of that would require fully inhabiting the identity of Sofia Restrepo permanently, embracing the woman I'd become instead of trying to resurrect who I used to be. "I've been thinking about that," I said. "About whether to keep being Sofia or try to find my way back to being Sofia." "You can't go back," my grandmother said with characteristic bluntness. That girl is gone. But you can decide who you want to become next. She was right, and I'd known it for weeks. The old Sofia Martinez, the one who'd believed in unconditional family love and trusted people at face value, couldn't exist in the world I now understood. But Sofia Restrepo, for all her effectiveness, felt like a costume I was tired of wearing. What if I became something else entirely? I asked. What if I took the best of both and left the rest behind? My mother looked intrigued. What would that look like? I keep the professional confidence and strategic thinking I developed as Sofia. But I also remember the warmth and empathy that Sofia had before everything fell apart. I stopped being afraid of trusting people, but I also stopped trusting blindly. It sounded good in theory, but the practical questions were more complicated. Where would I live? What would I call myself? How do you integrate two identities that were created in response to completely different circumstances? You could move back here, my mother suggested quietly. Not into your old room. I know that's not possible anymore. But the house is big enough for two adults who are figuring out how to be family again. The offer surprised me. We'd been dancing around each other for weeks, careful not to assume too much about what the other wanted from this fragile reconstruction of our relationship. Would you want that? I asked. I want the chance to know who my daughter becomes next, she said. I want to be part of your life in whatever form that takes. I want to prove that I can choose you over people who sound more convincing, even when it's difficult. My grandmother smiled. And I want to make sure nobody else tries to steal from this family while I'm still alive to do something about it. That made us all laugh, the first genuine laughter we'd shared since before my mother's devastating birthday wish. It felt like something loosening in my chest, like a knot I'd been carrying for months was finally beginning to untie. There's something else, I said, pulling out a folder I'd been carrying for weeks but hadn't known how to present. The bank offered me a permanent position heading up their new family financial fraud prevention program. It's a significant promotion with a salary that would let me help support you and Abuela instead of the other way around. The job offer had come with my real name on it. They'd done enough investigation to understand that Sofia Restrepo and Sofia Martinez were the same person, and they didn't care about the deception since it had led to exposing crimes they'd missed. They wanted someone who understood financial fraud from both sides, who could think like a criminal to catch criminals. It would mean staying in Portland. I continued. It would mean building a career around the skills I developed while planning Miguel's downfall. It would mean turning the worst period of my life into something useful for other families. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. It sounds perfect for the person you've become. And maybe it was. Maybe the daughter who'd been exiled from her family and the professional who'd infiltrated a bank to expose fraud could coexist in someone who helped other families navigate the dangerous intersection of love, money, and trust. Over the next hour, as we finished dinner and talked through the practical details of rebuilding our relationship, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the naive optimism of someone who believed everything would go back to the way it was, but the realistic hope of someone who understood that sometimes the best things are built from the wreckage of what came before. I have one condition, I said as we cleared the table. No more family members get access to anyone's financial information without multiple people knowing about it. No more trusting people just because they share our DNA. No more making major decisions without talking them through with someone who doesn't have a financial interest in the outcome. Agreed, my mother said immediately. And, I continued, we institute a family rule that anyone who claims another family member is lying or manipulating gets asked to provide evidence, and that evidence gets reviewed by someone neutral before any decisions are made. Also agreed. My grandmother nodded approvingly. You've learned that family love requires structure to survive. That's a hard lesson, but an important one. As I drove back to my apartment that night, soon to be my former apartment, if I decided to take my mother up on her offer, I realized that my disappearance was finally complete. Not because I'd vanished from my family's life, but because the person who'd walked into that kitchen 4 months ago carrying a homemade birthday cake was truly gone. In her place was someone who understood that protection sometimes looks like abandonment, that love sometimes requires deception, and that the most effective revenge is simply ensuring that truth has consequences. Miguel was in federal prison. Carlos was rebuilding his life under the shadow of his criminal record. Pierce had lost his law license and was facing his own prison time. Justice had been served with mathematical precision. But the real victory wasn't their punishment. It was the family that remained, scarred but stronger, wiser but still capable of love, bound together by the understanding that trust, once lost, must be earned back one careful conversation at a time. The ghost in the machine had accomplished her mission. Now it was time to see what the living could build from what she'd left behind. 3 months after moving back into the house on Elm Street, I discovered that rebuilding trust is like physical therapy after a devastating injury, painful, slow, and requiring daily commitment to exercises that sometimes feel pointless until suddenly, one day, you realize you can walk normally again. My mother and I had established routines that acknowledged who we'd become while honoring who we'd been. Sunday dinners with my grandmother, where we planned the week's financial decisions together. Wednesday evening walks through the neighborhood, during which we practiced the kind of honest conversation that might have prevented Miguel's manipulation in the first place. Saturday morning coffee in the kitchen, where our relationship had died and been reborn, talking through the challenges of coexistence between two women who'd learned to live independently. If you've ever tried to rebuild a relationship that was shattered by betrayal and rebuilt through strategic deception, if you've ever attempted to love someone while simultaneously protecting yourself from their capacity to hurt you, then you understand why some mornings I woke up exhausted before the day even began. The work was worth it, though. Slowly, carefully, we were creating something neither of us had experienced before, a mother-daughter relationship between equals, based on choice rather than obligation, maintained through transparency rather than assumption. My new position at the bank had evolved into something more significant than either of us had anticipated. The Family Financial Fraud Prevention Program I'd been hired to develop had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies, elder advocacy groups, and other financial institutions dealing with similar problems. I was consulting on cases across 3 states, helping families who'd been victimized by relatives who'd weaponized their trust. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become an expert in family financial manipulation by successfully manipulating my own family situation. But the skills I developed during my months as Sofia Restrepo, the ability to think strategically, to anticipate psychological vulnerabilities, to document evidence systematically, were proving invaluable in helping other families protect themselves from predators who exploited blood relationships. "You have a call," my assistant, Jennifer, said as I returned from a consultation meeting with the Portland Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. "A woman named Patricia Chun. She says her son has been pressuring her to change her will, and she found your name through the Elder Abuse Prevention Network." These calls had become routine over the past few months. Adult children convincing elderly parents that siblings were stealing from them. Financial advisors isolating clients from family members who might question their recommendations. Caregivers gradually gaining control of accounts belonging to the people they were supposed to protect. The patterns were always similar, but each family's story was unique in its details of betrayal and manipulation. "Mrs. Chun," I said as I took the call, "thank you for reaching out. Can you tell me what's been happening with your son?" What followed was a familiar story with unfamiliar details. Patricia Chun was a 74-year-old retired librarian whose adult son David had been systematically isolating her from her daughter Lisa, claiming that Lisa was planning to put their mother in a nursing home and steal her savings. David had convinced Patricia that he was the only family member she could trust and was now pressuring her to sign documents giving him power of attorney over her finances. "He says Lisa has been spreading lies about him to other family members," Patricia explained, her voice shaking with confusion and fear. "He says she's jealous because I've always been closer to him and that she's trying to turn me against him so she can control my money." The script was almost identical to what Miguel had used on my mother. Create division between family members. Position yourself as the only trustworthy protector. Gradually gain control over financial decisions while claiming to act in the victim's best interests. "Mrs. Chun," I said carefully, "when did David start expressing these concerns about Lisa? And has anything changed in your financial situation recently that might have prompted his sudden interest in protecting you?" "Well," Patricia said slowly, "my husband passed away last year, and there was a life insurance settlement. And David did seem more attentive after that. But he says it's because he's worried about me being alone, not because of the money. I'm sure he does say that, I replied. Can you tell me whether you've noticed any changes in David's financial situation recently? New expenses, new purchases, mentions of needing money for investments or opportunities. There was a long pause. He did mention something about a business opportunity that required a loan. And he's been having trouble with his mortgage payments. But he wouldn't steal from me. He's my son. The heartbreak in those last 4 words was devastating. He's my son. The same faith in family that had made my mother vulnerable to Miguel's manipulation, the same trust that predatory relatives exploited in families across the country every day. Mrs. Chun, I want to help you figure out what's really happening in your family. But first, I need to ask you something important. If I could show you evidence that David wasn't telling you the truth about Lisa, would you want to see it? Even if it was painful to learn. Another long pause. I suppose I would need to know the truth, even if it hurt. Good. That's the first step in protecting yourself. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something that might feel uncomfortable, but it's necessary. I want you to contact Lisa and ask her to meet with both of us together. Don't tell David about the meeting, and don't mention that you've spoken with me. Can you do that? You think David is lying to me, don't you? I think David is using techniques that are very common in family financial fraud cases. And I think you deserve to know the truth about what's happening in your family before you make any irreversible decisions about your finances. What followed was a 3-week investigation that felt like déjà vu with different characters. David Chen was indeed pressuring his mother to sign over financial control while systematically poisoning her relationship with his sister. Lisa, meanwhile, had been desperately trying to warn their mother about David's gambling addiction and mounting debts, only to have her concerns dismissed as jealousy and manipulation. The evidence was easier to gather this time. David was less sophisticated than Miguel had been, and I had resources and experience that had taken me months to develop during my first case. Bank records showing David's gambling losses, documentation of his lies about Lisa's supposed plans for nursing home placement, even recordings of him coaching his mother on what to say to attorneys when discussing her estate planning. But the hardest part wasn't gathering evidence. It was helping Patricia Chin understand that her son's love for her was real, even though his financial desperation had led him to see her as a solution to his problems rather than a person deserving protection. Love and exploitation aren't mutually exclusive, I explained to Patricia and Lisa during our final meeting. David probably does love you, Mrs. Chen. But his gambling addiction has created a desperation that's making him see your money as the answer to his problems. He's convinced himself that borrowing from you temporarily is justified because he plans to pay it back, even though his track record suggests he can't. Patricia was crying softly, holding her daughter's hand while processing the reality that both her children loved her, but only one of them was capable of putting her well-being ahead of their own financial needs. What do I do now? She asked. David is still my son. I can't just cut him out of my life. You don't have to cut him out, I replied. But you can set boundaries that protect you while still maintaining a relationship with him. You can require that any financial discussions include Lisa. You can refuse to sign any documents without having them reviewed by an independent attorney. You can make it clear that you love David but won't enable his gambling addiction by giving him access to money he can't manage responsibly. Helping the Chin family navigate their crisis while maintaining their relationships taught me something important about my own situation. The binary choice between total trust and complete exile that had defined my relationship with my mother wasn't the only option available to families dealing with financial manipulation. Sometimes love required boundaries rather than banishment. Sometimes protection looked like structure rather than separation. When I got home that evening, I found my mother in the kitchen making empanadas, a project that always indicated she was processing something emotionally significant. The smell of cumin and saffron filled the house, transporting me back to childhood afternoons when cooking together had been our primary form of bonding. How did it go with the Chin family? She asked as I washed my hands and automatically began helping with the assembly line of dough, filling, and folding that empanada making required. Successful, I think. The mother is going to maintain a relationship with her son, but she's putting financial safeguards in place that will protect her from his gambling addiction. My mother nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like a healthier solution than what we went through. Different situations require different approaches, I said. Miguel was deliberately predatory. He planned and executed a scheme to steal from elderly relatives while systematically destroying their relationships with protective family members. David Chun is desperate and making terrible decisions, but he's not a sociopath. Do you think, my mother asked carefully, that we could have found a middle ground with Miguel? If we'd understood what was happening earlier? It was a question she'd been circling around for months, and I understood why. The completeness of Miguel's downfall, 7 years in federal prison, permanent destruction of his career and reputation, sometimes felt disproportionate when we remembered the nephew we'd thought we knew before discovering his crimes. No, I said definitively. Miguel's scheme required ongoing deception and manipulation. He wasn't making desperate mistakes. He was implementing a long-term plan to steal from his own family while positioning himself to inherit money that didn't belong to him. The only middle ground with someone like that is continued victimization. My mother was quiet for a moment, carefully sealing the edges of an empanada with the precise technique her own mother had taught her decades earlier. I used to think forgiveness meant pretending bad things hadn't happened, she said finally. I thought family loyalty meant giving people unlimited chances to hurt you because they shared your blood. But watching you work with other families has taught me something different. What's that? Forgiveness can coexist with consequences. Love can coexist with boundaries. Family loyalty can coexist with self-protection. She looked up from her work and met my eyes. I forgive Miguel for what he did to us, but I'm glad he's in prison where he can't hurt other families. I love him because he's my nephew, but I also understand that he's a criminal who made choices that deserve punishment. It was the most psychologically sophisticated thing I'd ever heard my mother say, and it represented months of growth that had been as painful for her as my own transformation had been for me. I'm proud of who you've become, Mom, I said, and meant it completely. I'm proud of who we've become, she corrected. Both of us. Together. As we finished making empanadas and started preparing them for baking, I realized that the revenge I'd planned so meticulously had accomplished something I'd never intended. It had forced both of us to grow into people capable of loving each other realistically rather than romantically. The woman who'd wished me out of her life had learned to trust strategically. The daughter who'd disappeared to protect her family had learned to love with boundaries intact. We were both different people now, and the relationship we were building was stronger for acknowledging that difference instead of trying to pretend we could return to the innocence we'd lost. Outside, Portland's spring rain was washing the streets clean, and inside, two women who'd learned that sometimes the most profound love requires the most strategic thinking were creating something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. 1 year after my mother's birthday wish sent me into exile, I stood in the same kitchen where our relationship had shattered, preparing to celebrate her 58th birthday with a red velvet cake that looked identical to the one I'd brought that devastating day, but carried completely different meaning. This time, I wasn't the hopeful daughter seeking approval. I wasn't the desperate exile planning revenge. I wasn't even the calculated professional executing strategic justice. I was something new entirely, a woman who had learned that the most powerful form of love is the kind that remains stable even when tested by the absolute worst human behavior. If you've been with me through this entire story, if you've watched me transform from victim to vigilante to something more complex and sustainable, then you understand that the most profound changes aren't the dramatic ones that happen in moments of crisis, but the quiet ones that accumulate over months of choosing to build rather than destroy. The past year had brought changes none of us could have anticipated. My work with the Family Financial Fraud Prevention Program had expanded into a nonprofit organization that consulted with families, law enforcement, and financial institutions across the Pacific Northwest. We'd helped protect over 40 elderly victims from relatives who saw inheritance as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. Miguel had been transferred to a federal prison in California, where he was serving a sentence and reportedly participating in programs for financial crime offenders. Carlos had completed his community service and was slowly rebuilding relationships with family members who'd been willing to forgive his role in the conspiracy. Jonathan Pierce had been disbarred and sentenced to 3 years in prison for his violations of fiduciary duty. Justice, as it turned out, was a process rather than an event. But the most significant transformation had been in the relationship between my mother and me. We'd learned to love each other as the people we actually were rather than the people we'd imagined each other to be. She'd learned to trust her own judgment while accepting input from people who cared about her welfare. I'd learned to offer protection without demanding control, to set boundaries without building walls. We'd both learned that strategic thinking and genuine emotion weren't mutually exclusive. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock, and I opened it to find my grandmother carrying a gift bag and wearing a smile that suggested she was pleased with whatever surprise she had planned. "Abuela, you didn't need to bring anything," I said, taking her coat. "It's not for your mother," she replied with a mischievous grin. "It's for you. A birthday present 1 year late." Behind her came Jessica, my college friend who'd flown in from Chicago to meet the family she'd heard so much about but never encountered. Jessica represented the continuity in my life, the relationship that had remained stable while everything else was falling apart and being rebuilt. "So you're the famous Sofia Restrepo," Jessica said, hugging me in the entryway. "Or are you Sofia Martinez today?" "I'm whoever I need to be," I replied, and for the first time, that answer felt complete rather than evasive. Over the past year, I'd integrated the two identities in ways that felt natural rather than calculated. Professionally, I remained Sofia Restrepo. The name carried weight in law enforcement and financial security circles, and changing it would have disrupted the work I was doing to help other families. Personally, I'd become Sofia Martinez again, but a version strengthened by Sofia's strategic capabilities and professional confidence. My mother had initially struggled with the dual identity, sometimes unsure which version of me she was talking to. But gradually, she'd come to understand that they weren't different people, they were different aspects of the same person, called forth by different circumstances and requirements. "The cake looks perfect," my mother said as I carried it from the kitchen to the dining room table. "Just like the one from last year." "Same recipe," I confirmed. But I think we can all agree that the context is significantly different. The table was set with the good china, just as it had been for every birthday celebration of my childhood. But this time, the guest list included people who'd been chosen rather than simply inherited. Jessica, who represented my life outside the family drama. Detective Rodriguez from the Portland Police Financial Crimes Unit, who'd become a friend through our professional collaboration. Patricia and Lisa Chen, who'd become like extended family after I'd helped them navigate their own crisis. These were people who understood that families could be built as well as born into, that loyalty could be earned rather than assumed, that love could be strategic without being manipulative. As we gathered around the table, my grandmother stood up and raised her wine glass. "I want to make a toast," she announced, "to the women in this family who learned that protecting the people you love sometimes requires becoming someone they don't recognize." The toast was directed at both my mother and me, acknowledging that we'd both made difficult choices in service of family preservation. My mother had chosen to believe Miguel's lies because she thought she was protecting herself from manipulation. I'd chosen strategic deception because I thought it was the only way to expose the truth effectively. We'd both been right and wrong, and we'd both learned from the consequences of our choices. "To strategic love," I added, raising my own glass. "And to the understanding that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who teach you to love yourself the best." The birthday celebration that followed was everything the previous year's party should have been: genuine joy, honest conversation, and the comfortable chaos of people who'd chosen to be together rather than simply finding themselves related by accident of birth. But the most meaningful moment came later, after the guests had left and my mother and I were cleaning up together in the kitchen where everything had started. "I have something for you," she said, pulling out a small wrapped box from the drawer where she kept important papers. "I was going to give this to you last year before everything fell apart." Inside the box was my grandmother's engagement ring, a simple solitaire that had been in our family for 3 generations, traditionally passed from mother to daughter when the daughter was ready to build her own family. "I'm not getting married anytime soon," I said, touched but confused by the timing. "That's not why I'm giving it to you," my mother replied. "I'm giving it to you because you've proven that you understand what it means to build something lasting from imperfect materials. You took a broken family and made it stronger. You took betrayal and turned it into protection for other families. You took pain and transformed it into purpose. She helped me slide the ring onto my right hand, where it caught the kitchen light and sparkled with the accumulated hope of 3 generations of women who'd learned to love strategically. The most important family you'll ever build, my mother continued, is the one you choose to create with yourself. The relationship between who you are and who you decide to become. You've done that work, Sophia. You've earned this ring. As I looked down at the ring that represented generations of women who'd navigated the complicated mathematics of love, loss, and reconstruction, I realized that my revenge had been complete in ways I'd never planned. I'd set out to make Miguel pay for his crimes, and I'd succeeded. But I'd also accidentally created something much more valuable, a version of myself capable of protecting the people I loved without sacrificing my ability to love them authentically. The daughter who'd been wished out of existence had been replaced by someone who understood that disappearing sometimes meant becoming invisible just long enough to see clearly, and that the most profound revenge against people who try to destroy your family is building something stronger from what they leave behind. There's one more thing, my mother said, pulling out another document from the drawer. I had a new will drawn up. Want to guess what it says? That you're leaving everything to the cat? I suggested, making her laugh. It says that my daughter Sofia Martinez, also known professionally as Sofia Restrepo, is the sole beneficiary of my estate, with the understanding that she'll use whatever resources I leave behind to continue protecting families from people who would exploit their love and trust. The will was more than a legal document. It was a recognition that the woman who'd returned to her family was someone who could be trusted with both inheritance and legacy. There's also a provision, my mother added with a smile, stating that any family member who attempts to challenge this will or manipulate me into changing it will receive exactly $1 and a copy of Miguel's criminal conviction records, just as a reminder of what happens to people who mistake kindness for stupidity. I burst out laughing, both at the practical wisdom of the provision and at the evidence of how much my mother had learned about protecting herself from future manipulation. I love you, Mom, I said, and meant it in ways that encompassed everything we'd been through, everything we'd learned, and everything we'd built together. I love you too, Sophia. All of you. Every version you've been, and whoever you decide to become next. As we finished cleaning the kitchen and prepared to head upstairs to our respective bedrooms in the house we now shared as equals rather than as parent and dependent child, I reflected on the year that had transformed us both. The woman who'd wished me out of existence had learned to love strategically. The daughter who disappeared had learned to return with boundaries intact. Together, we'd created something neither of us could have imagined, a family built on choice rather than obligation, maintained through transparency rather than assumption, strengthened by consequences rather than weakened by unconditional forgiveness. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've watched me transform from victim to strategist to something more sustainable and wise, then you understand that the most powerful revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's becoming someone who can't be hurt in the same way twice while still remaining capable of love. Miguel got 7 years in federal prison. I got a lifetime of understanding that strategic love is the only kind that survives contact with reality. The ghost in the machine had accomplished her mission and learned to live again. And if you've ever felt powerless in your own family, if you've ever wondered whether love requires you to accept mistreatment, if you've ever needed permission to protect yourself from people who share your DNA, then remember this. Disappearing sometimes means becoming invisible just long enough to learn who you really are when you're not trying to be who other people need you to be. The most profound love stories aren't about finding someone who completes you. They're about becoming someone who's complete enough to choose love strategically rather than desperately. Hit that subscribe button if this story taught you something about the difference between family loyalty and family wisdom, and let me know in the comments if you've ever had to choose between being loved and being respected. Sometimes the people who wish you out of their lives are giving you the greatest gift possible, the freedom to become someone worthy of the love you've always deserved.